G'day humans, Chris Stead from Finder here. We're talking tech, and today the subject is Apple's brand new MacBook Pro M2 13-inch. Now, we were lucky to get early access here at Finder to the laptop, and our legendary technology journalist Alex Kidman has been putting it through its paces. So I thought I'd jump on a quick chat with him to find out everything he's learned about Apple's new laptop so you can decide whether it's the right laptop for you. Let's jump in, have a chat to Alex. Alex, mate, thanks very much for joining us.
My pleasure.
Now, mate, you've been busy coming to terms with the new MacBook Pro M2 13-inch. What's the big feature for this year's installment from Apple?
So the big feature is the M2 processor, and it's also sort of the big problem because it's sort of the only feature that's new. And it means that this particular MacBook, and bear in mind, Apple's got a lot of MacBooks, this particular MacBook sits in a really odd niche. I can't exactly work out who it's for, despite the fact that that M2 processor is really quite impressive in and of itself.
Yeah, now, something that might instantly confuse customers, I guess, is that the M2 chip, the new one, isn't necessarily faster than the M1 chips they'll find, because there's the basic M1 chip, and you've got the M1 Pro, the M1 Max, and then I think there's an M1 Ultra as well. Is that correct?
Yeah. So Apple iterated on the M1, its first Apple silicon system, quite a bit, and it's still selling those units. And as you say, quite a few of them are faster. So for that original M1, which you got in like the 13-inch MacBook Air, the 13-inch MacBook Pro that this replaces entirely, but also things like the iPad and the Mac Mini, they were all much of a muchness. They were all pretty much the same performance-wise. But then when they brought out the 14 and 16-inch MacBook Pros, and when they brought out the Mac Studio, they went into the Pro, Max, and Ultra spaces, and they are generally more powerful than the M2 is. Now, at some point in the future, everyone is predicting that Apple will come out with M2 Pro and M2 Max, M2 Ultra. A lot of the rumors suggest that we won't see those this year. However, the chip shortages being what they are. So for the moment, you have this confusing situation where the M2 exists right now only in this 13-inch MacBook Pro, although within a matter of weeks, it'll be joined by the considerably more redesigned MacBook Air M2, which for a lot of broad consumers, I actually think might be the better buy, and that's without having been able to go hands-on with it.
Oh, we might dive into that a little bit more towards the end after we talk about the M2 Pro 13. Now, in the early benchmarks that I've been looking at, it looks like the M2 chip sits somewhere between the M1 and the M1 Pro in terms of speed. Is that what you found with your testing?
Yeah, pretty much. If you're looking at it, like if you've got an M1 MacBook Pro, the 13-inch, and you're looking at the M2 and thinking, oh, should I upgrade? I don't know that the money's going to be worth it. What I've seen is about 10 to 20% performance increase. Now, that's very classical computing. You and I have both been around long enough to know year in, year out, you get these new notebook models and they're kind of 10 to 20% faster than the ones that came before. That is exactly what Apple has done here. They've grabbed the existing chassis, the existing design, and they just said, right, the newer chip is in this, it's faster, hurrah. Doesn't make as much upgrade sense from the M1, but if you were sitting on an older Intel-based MacBook Pro or MacBook Air or MacBook indeed, then you'd see a much bigger difference, of course.
Yeah, I mean, like in obviously the reveal for this M2 chip and the laptop itself, Apple was talking up gaming specifically, also talking up about high-end software, your Adobe's, that type of thing. What's your moment-to-moment experience been like using a laptop?
So it's good. I mean, more power is always good when you've got a need for it, for sure. So, I've been doing things like producing my podcast Vertical Hold with it and producing videos with it, and it is faster. I did run it head-to-head with an M1 13-inch MacBook Pro, and it could finish things, as I say, roughly about 10 to 20%. That overhead is variable, depends on the app, depends on what else you've got running, of course. But it is better, it is faster. You should expect that. It's a newer model. On the gaming front, it's always a little bit harder to judge on the Mac side of things. Stuff is so much better in Mac gaming than it used to be even 5-10 years ago. But I certainly wouldn't say to people, buy this because it's a gaming laptop. At this price, you can start looking at some pretty serious Windows gaming laptops, which really will still run rings around this.
One of the places, I guess, where the M2 chip is showing better performance than some of those M1 chips is with the neural engine, which is supposed to be 40% faster. From my understanding, that's more to do with kind of the machine learning and the AI side of things. So is that something that consumers should be looking at and going, oh, well, that's a big improve?
Look, it's an improvement, and it's an improvement that software has to target. And right now, there doesn't seem to be a lot of evidence of applications that are really specifically doing that. You've still got that odd situation as well with Apple Silicon to bear in mind that not every app is optimized for Apple Silicon. So for Adobe, for example, if you load up Photoshop, that's a native Apple Silicon app, and it will run really, really fast. But Adobe's own Audition, its audio editing software, still needs Rosetta 2 to run. So that's still older Intel-style code. So not everything is going to talk to all the parts, including the neural engine of the M2 in the same way. I wouldn't be going out of my way to buy one on that basis, even though it does make, of course, for a great headline number for Apple.
Yeah, so I mean, one of the pros of the M2 is supposed to be its efficiency, and Apple's touting battery life up to 20 hours, which would be lovely. But what did you actually get when you were testing?
So I didn't quite hit 20 hours, and I'm totally used to that. Most manufacturers' battery claims are optimistic, to put it politely. But I could get 13 to 15 hours without too much trouble. Now, I've only had the thing for a week. I have not been able to test it over many repetitive cycles of testing, so those are somewhat qualified numbers. It seems to basically be sitting in about the same space as the M1 did, which means for most people, it's probably going to be a very good all-day battery life prospect if you are away from power. You are limited, though, in that it's USB-C charging, where the rest of the MacBook lineup, including the cheaper Air, is MagSafe now. So you've got to sacrifice one of the two USB Thunderbolt ports on the side for charging when you do power it back up.
Yeah, I understand as well that it's a bit lower on ports with display ports as well, to some of the MacBook Pros we saw come through the last generation.
Yeah, so this is one of these areas where I was getting at in terms of being this sort of odd little niche product, because they've kept the exact same chassis as they've had before. That's a very Apple move. They only iterate their designs very slowly, but because they made that call, you've now got this situation where the 14 and 16 inch have 4 ports to either side, which is great if you need that flexibility, great if you want multi-monitor. Worth noting as well, the M2, like the basic vanilla M1 before it, only specifically supports one external monitor. There are hacks around that, but they're not official ones. This has 2 ports, same as its predecessor. So if you've got power running into there, you've got 1 port left. They're basically saying, look, go out and buy a USB-C hub for this thing. Otherwise, you're not really going to be able to use peripherals with it. Now, for some users, of course, that might not be a huge concern, but it does feel really weird to me that this Pro laptop has less flexibility than the cheaper Air that's coming next month, because while that too only has 2 USB-C ports, it's also got MagSafe charging. So you could charge it and still have those other 2 ports free for external storage or monitors or whatever else you need to plug into a MacBook.
Yeah, so I've got a MacBook Pro that I use. It's a couple of years old now, and definitely cooling is an issue with it. It definitely gets hot under load and does make a bit of noise with the fan. How have things improved over the years with the MacBooks, and what have you found with the cooling, the active cooling that Apple's been promoting about the new MacBook Pro?
Look, it's good. I think the biggest jump that you would see, and anyone jumping from what I'm guessing is an older Intel-based Mac, is that once you get into the Apple Silicon world, because it's this whole system on chip, because the processor and the GPU and the RAM and the storage are all on this one silicon wafer, the thermal management is totally different. And so these systems just do not, or in my experience, at least I should say, I'm sure there's someone out there, but in my experience, these systems do not run as hot. This has a fan where the Air versions of the M1 and M2 don't. I've really rarely noticed it kicking up all that much. And I mean, it's fairly cold in Sydney at the moment. A nice warm laptop might be a good thing right now, but it's not really been a big concern in the same way, and I agree with you, as it was on much older MacBooks. I mean, experimentally, I pulled a 2015 MacBook Pro out of mothballs and ran some benchmarks on that just to get a range of what people might expect if they were upgrading from much older machines. The moment I started benchmarking it, it sounded like a jet engine taking off. The MacBook Pro M2, by comparison, just silent like an EV.
I assume we can read these benchmarks in the articles on the fine.com website as well?
Absolutely. My full review is up right now.
All right, I'll stick that in the comments below as well, so you guys can find that. Now, we just spoke a little bit about people who might be upgrading, or that this is probably a good option for people who are upgrading from older models from 2, 3, 4 years ago. In terms of, I mean, you said the chassis doesn't change too much, but in terms of the actual just design and the typing experience, is there anything there that those type of consumers will pick up on as big improvements?
Look, if you were coming from a much older MacBook, and I'm talking about the generation here that had that awful butterfly keyboard, the really, really flat one that Apple insisted was gorgeous, and pretty much anyone who types for a living very quickly worked out would gum up and just stop working. It was terrible, awful thing. It doesn't have that. So that's going to be a big plus. That's something you'll really, really notice. But if I was coming from that kind of older system, I would certainly at least wait a couple of weeks for the Air to come out, for it to be tested and benchmarked. And certainly I'm looking forward to doing that, because that's going to have the same kind of experience and the added bonus of MagSafe, and even the added bonus of a better webcam. This thing's still sitting on a 720p webcam because it's the same design, because it's the same chassis. Apple obviously can make more money that way, but it does put that in this odd little niche where I think the pro power users, they're probably better off with the 14-inch. Yes, it's a little bit bigger, but I don't know it's going to make that much difference versus the amount of additional processing power and those extra ports. Whereas the more regular consumer users, maybe the new MacBook Air, maybe even the old MacBook Air, because while the old MacBook Pro is no longer being sold, there's a scaled-down version of the M1 MacBook Air that Apple's still selling. It's its cheapest laptop. I suspect that thing is going to sell very, very well indeed.
Yeah, look, I was going to ask you next about, how does this sting the wallet? What's the value proposition here for this particular new MacBook Pro M2 compared to what Apple's still selling? And obviously, you've already compared this a lot to the upcoming Air as well. So do you have some price on the upcoming Air versus this? And what do you think about the pricing for the MacBook Pro M2?
So the new model starts at $1,999. You can bump that up considerably if you want to bump up the internal storage and the RAM. And actually, this is one of the other newer details with it. It can go up to 24 gigabytes of RAM, not terabytes, my goodness. But that would be phenomenally expensive. Now, I should say the model that I've tested is only the regular 8 gig model. That entry level 1,999 model. So you could certainly get a little bit more performance overhead with more RAM, but Apple does charge for that. Because it's all on that one silicon wafer, though, you've got to keep in mind, you can never upgrade the RAM, you can never upgrade the internal storage. You can whack on an external hard drive if you like, but it's all one thing, set, signed, sealed, delivered. So keep that in mind when you're ordering them. Comparatively, the new MacBook Air that's coming has, I think it's 2 fewer GPU cores, so it might be slightly lower in performance, although you can spec it up to be identical to this machine if you want it to be. And as we mentioned, the redesign, better ports, better webcam, even a slightly bigger screen, it's got smaller bezels. That's $100 cheaper than this at its base price. There's a $1,499 M1 MacBook Air. That's their cheapest model. Then when you get up into the 14-inch and above, you're inching closer to $3,000 outright, which is obviously much more a pro price. There is definitely a gulf there. But I think within that pro market, within that market of people who are doing lots of video editing or lots of really calculation-intensive work, whatever it might be, that efficiency gain is more than going to outweigh that cost.
I should point out there for any of our international visitors, that's AU dollars we're talking here. And
yeah, absolutely.
I did actually just spec it up on the Apple website just to see what it'd come in at. And yeah, if you push it up to 1 terabyte internal storage and up to that 24 gigabyte RAM ceiling, you're looking at about 3,200, I think it was. So it jumps up pretty quickly.
Yeah, and look, at that point, while I don't have benchmarks to hand to talk through what the difference of RAM would make, I think people know what the difference of storage would make. At that point, I'd seriously be looking at that 14-inch MacBook Pro, because all the signs are that we're not going to see a refresh on that for at least 6 months, maybe even 12 months with how the chip shortage has been going. Apple, though, have always charged a serious premium for both RAM and storage, and that just hasn't changed in the Apple Silicon era.
Well, that leads to my final question, actually. I was going to ask, you mentioned this at the start, that we're looking like there's anticipation that we'll see an M2 Pro chip, an M2 Max chip, possibly even an Ultra, and obviously 14-inch and 16-inch versions of the MacBook Pro in the future. Do you think there's a fair validity, given that this kind of laptop, as you say, looks a bit niche, to just hang out and wait to see what happens in 6 months or so?
Look, I think for consumers, it totally comes down to what you've got at the moment, what your needs are. That's always the story with this kind of stuff. I can't see the sense in rushing to buy this just because it's the first M2 model that you can get your hands on. I would absolutely wait until the Air is out, until Finder's had a chance to actually test the Air and give our verdict on it, because the gap between them is so small relative to the amount of use you're going to get out of a new laptop. A couple of weeks means nothing. Apple, of course, never comments on rumor and speculation. Only Tim Cook knows for sure, and for all I know, they could be holding an event at the end of next month to say, and here's the M2 Pro. But an awful lot of the research that people have done into this suggests that ain't the case, that they'll probably sit on it for 6+ months. Now, if you can afford to wait that time and work with what you've got, then great. If not, if you're in the market for a new machine, I would wait at least until the Air comes out to see how that compares, but also compare your needs, because for those Pro users, I think the power of a 14-inch MacBook Pro with that M1 Pro so outclasses what the M2 can do right now that it's worth considering over and above this model. If Apple had changed up the chassis, if they'd said, yeah, new design, better webcams, better everything, be a very, very different story. They didn't, and I think consumers really do need to keep that in mind.
Yeah, and to your point, when I was doing that spec out of the MacBook Pro M2 today, it was a 5 to 6 week shipping on that as well. So
you'll be waiting that long anyway.
You're waiting that long anyway. Look, mate, it sounds like we should get together again in a couple of weeks and talk about the new Air and do a comparison there for those who are interested in the two of them.
That sounds like an excellent plan. Looking forward to it.
All right, mate. Thanks very much for joining me and for your thoughts. Very thorough review as usual. Make sure you jump across to the Find.com to your website so you can see those benchmarks for yourself and read a much more thorough rundown of everything there is to know about the MacBook Pro M2. Thanks, Alex.
My pleasure.
So there you have it, guys. Alex's thoughts on the MacBook Pro M2 13-inch. Now, I'll put a link in the description below to his full review. Make sure you go and check that out. Also, make sure you check out other reviews here on the channel about various laptops, some of which I've also done with Alex as well. As you can tell, he really does know his stuff. You'll also find on the find.com.au website a look through at the best laptops money can buy in Australia at the moment over a range of categories, as well as some of those peripherals that you might need to make the most of your MacBook experience if you decide to go ahead and pick one up. Otherwise, for me, it's time to get back into some gaming and some technology.